Welcome, everybody, to Connecting the Universe. I'm author and researcher Mike Ricksecker, back at you with another interactive class out of the secret library of the Connected Universe. All right, tonight we're going to be asking the question, was Atlantis, the lost civilization, the lost continent of Atlantis, was it actually in Egypt? We've talked a little bit about this before, and well, we're going to dive right back into it. It's actually been a little while since we've done this exclusively here on Connecting the Universe. We've kind of sprinkled it in, talking about Egypt and stargates and some other different things, but this is just going to be exclusively Atlantis this evening. I want to let those that are watching the or listening to the podcast version of this later, I want to invite you every Wednesday night, 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, connecteduniverseportal.com to the live version of this broadcast. And, come interact with us, ask your questions, watch the video presentations, the slideshows, all those wonderful things. You can catch the YouTube part of it, but on connecteduniverseportal.com, you also get that after show as well, where you can ask some more exclusive questions. We have some additional content back there, and we just have a good time. Lots of other things there in the Connected Universe portal as well, such as we got the monthly Q&A videos. Got one coming up here. July just ended. So we got one of those coming up here. Exclusive articles, insider travel blogs. We got all the footage from Egypt, American Southwest. We get into portal, stargates, the time travel courses up there. You got the secret library, all kinds of material back there, connecteduniverseportal.com. For this particular topic here, I do want to point people to the On the Trail of Atlantis and Egypt blog article that's posted at connecteduniverse.substack.com. And there's all kinds of other videos, of course, within the portal. We have exclusive Atlantis, Egypt footage there as well. And this is a new one. I haven't really done like a formal analysis, and this is not a sponsored video, but I have become a brand ambassador for, wouldn't you know it, Atlantis Nutrition. So there is that, atlantisnutrition.com. You can use discount code Ricksecker10, get a discount there. But I have become a brand ambassador for that. So check it out. It's good stuff. Most of their supplements are gummies, and I've always been a sucker for gummies. So come check it out. All right. So who's in the house? Well, there's Jen is in the house and saying that the lights look great. Yeah, I've kind of got a chance to, well, really about 45 minutes before the class started, I'm like, I should probably do something with the lights. And so I pulled the shelving unit out, got the stuff strung up there. It needs a little work, but yeah, is what it is. Karen's in the house as well. So, all right, let's go ahead and get this started as people continue to filter in. Pydora Farms, there's Lisa. All right. So, Atlantis. What was this lost civilization of Atlantis? What do we actually know about it? Because there's so many ideas and stories and myths. I mean, we have, of course, what Plato wrote. We're going to get into that. I left the book over there. I meant to have it here, but, I was trying to get material together. So what we do know is that the Timaeus and Critias, written by Plato. In the Timaeus, very, very little. It's a small little part that's in there about Atlantis. The Critias was supposed to be a much more extensive work on Atlantis, and we don't really know what happened. We don't know if he just decided to stop, if it got lost to time. We're not really sure on that. But let's go ahead and introduce you to the people. The story of Atlantis is brought to you by Solon and Plato. Well, the work was written by Plato, but the story actually comes from Solon, who they're a couple hundred years removed from each other, and they were actually related. But what we know of it was written by Plato. He lived about 427 to 348 BC. And again, what we have from him is very small, handful of paragraphs, again, from the Timaeus, full account in the Critias before it just cut out. And here's the last line. Zeus is about to speak about the quote unquote wretched state of this admirable stock, and then done, is gone. We don't know where it went, what happened. We do discover throughout these two texts that the story did originate in Egypt. Again, brought to us by Solon. He went to Egypt. He went throughout the land, studied in several different places, most notably the Temple of Sais, where he met with the priests and they told him the stories. Now, we discover throughout these texts that we did not get the full account from Solon because, quote, he was more concerned with the uprisings and other evils he found here on his return. So basically, he spent all this time studying in Egypt, came back to Greece, found it in, there were uprisings, there was discord, there were civil wars breaking out. You have to remember with the way that Greece was set up, they were, even though they were all related to each other, they were set up in these separate little city-states. And many times those city-states would bicker and fight in war against each other. Athens versus Sparta. They were both Greek, but they were separate city-states that would war against each other, and several of the other ones within there as well. So he came back from Egypt, and there was a lot of civil unrest. And so he spent a lot of his time concentrating on that and writing about that and speaking about that rather than relating his experiences in Egypt. Although he did to a degree, because he did relate some of the story and it did get passed down through Plato. So whatever they were able to cobble together, thank you guys. We do have a little snippet from Plutarch. So Plutarch, he doesn't really tell us a whole lot. It's like very, very little. It's like a one-liner, and this is it. Plutarch says, speaking of Solon, quote, he also spent some time in the studies of Xenophus of Heliopolis and Sanchis of Sais, who were very learned priests. From these, as Plato says, he heard the story of the lost Atlantis and tried to introduce it in a poetical form to the Greeks. He next sailed to Cyprus, and then it continues on. So that's it. So I guess it's actually 2 lines, but that's all he tells us. So he gives us some names. Xenophus, which is a priest in Heliopolis, and Sanchis, which is a priest in Sais. And that's it. And that's where we get the name when we start talking about that the story of Atlantis comes from the priest Sanchis at the Temple of Sais. This is where it comes from. It actually comes from Plutarch, who was even further after these guys. So I'm not going to remember the date offhand, but basically you had Solon about 630 to 560 BC. You had Plato 427 to 348 BC, and then Plutarch was even after those guys. So we're having this dissemination of information down the road. But so this is, let's talk a little bit about the Temple of Sais. So Temple of Sais, this is where Sanchis hung out. This is where Solon got the story of Atlantis from. And here it is today. So trying to get any information from the Temple of Sais to try to discover more about Atlantis is going to be impossible because there's nothing left. It's a complete ruin. This is an illustration from about 120 years ago of Sais, and there's at least taller ruins then, but today it's basically like a mud pit which is really, really unfortunate. So let's talk a little bit about what we can learn from these works. In trying to dismiss the Atlantis tale, I've heard a lot of talking heads have tried to say, well, Atlantis couldn't have existed in the time of Solon and Plato. It's just, it couldn't have existed around that time frame. You look at like different physical places that they discuss. Some of those ideas of where Atlantis actually rested. There's a lot of different ideas of throughout the Mediterranean and beyond of where Atlantis actually was. And you have some talking heads and even some academics. It can't be around that time. The story doesn't fit the time of, Plato and Solon. But here's the thing, is that in the very beginning of the Critias, this is what Plato says: we must remind ourselves that in all, 9,000 years have elapsed, according to the records, since the war occurred between those who lived outside and all those who lived inside the Pillar of Hercules. Now, the Pillar of Hercules, we've kind of traced that down to being the either side of the Strait of Gibraltar. So as you're coming out of the Mediterranean into the Atlantic, those two sides are supposed to be the pillars of Hercules. 9,000 years from the time that Solon got the story from Sanchis. So when was Solon around? About 600 BC. So 9,000 years before that, I mean, you can math that out pretty easily, right? You can calculate that. So that's 9,600 BC, which is 11,700 years ago, which is when this story was supposed to have taken place. Well, what was going on 11,700 years ago? Well, that puts us right at the end of the Younger Dryas, which is that cooling period that we don't really understand what happened there, why things cooled off. This is supposed to be that era when there was supposed to be the great cataclysm. You hear about like the Younger Dryas comet impact theory, or and that comes from Graham Hancock, and he's kind of the face of that, even though there are scientists that are behind that. He's just been a proponent for that science and trying to put it forth. Robert Schoch, geologist, he's the one that redated the Sphinx with John Anthony West. He says that it was some sort of solar flare. Whatever it was, this was that really, really strange time where there was some sort of great cataclysm and something happened. Well, that kind of does fit our Atlantis story. For some sort of context here, it's also around the time that Göbekli Tepe was built. So this dates to about, well, the furthest we've been able to date it back so far is 11,500 years ago. But with that dating, you got to remember we've only uncovered a very small amount of the entire site. Göbekli Tepe is actually very huge. And what they have uncovered, they've kind of gone into restoration mode and making sure that they're able to preserve it. You kind of see here, this is before they put the big tint over the top of it. And this year is after they put the big tint over the top of it. And they're trying to do things to make sure that, the pillars don't fall over and these sorts of things, those T-shaped pillars. So the site could very well go even further back. It's a very highly controversial site because of the fact that our traditional archaeology tries to tell us that, well, people are just hunter-gatherers at the time. Well, okay, what in the world were hunter-gatherers doing building something like this? It's staying in one spot like that to build these massive structures. you're not really free roaming and hunting and gathering. This is really a type of structure in which people have to stay there and should be cultivating some crops and things like this. And that is the area of the world where they say that cultivation of crops really began, where people began growing grains and cereals and things like this. Got a $10 super chat here from Super Chat Superstar Tom McNicholas. Mike Ricksecker's Tours of Atlantis coming soon. That's right. That's right. Actually, that would be pretty cool. Find Atlantis and we'll go check it out. But if it is under the waters, then well, we don't want to. We don't want to have happen to us what happened to that crew that went down to the Titanic, right? That would not be fun. Although I would love to explore way down there and check stuff out. That was kind of the way off topic, but just thinking of that, they had a whole 20-minute video of just sending the rover down there and actually getting a video virtual tour of the whole Titanic down there. That was really, really cool. It's the same company that had the unfortunate accident. So it's also this 11,700 mark mentioned the redating of the Sphinx, which was highly controversial back in the early 90s. And you had traditional archaeology saying, well, we don't have sites that are that old. And then Göbekli Tepe came along, like, oh, I guess we do. So the Sphinx, and then there's the water, the blatant water erosion. I can actually show you, should take a photo of it one of these days. I could actually show you this type of water erosion right outside of my front yard between the lawn and the sidewalk. It's this exact same thing. So the middle banding there is wind erosion. That's not the part that Shock is talking about. It's the vertical channeling that is very blatantly water runoff. And for that amount of water runoff in this area of the world, 11,700 years ago, during that era of the Younger Dryas, is a cooler time in history for the Earth. And then this is before the Sahara became a desert. So it was more like a safari type region. So you had they were kind of like plains, and you had that type of a landscape going on out there. But after it warmed back up, then the Sahara became a desert. And I don't say the Sahara Desert because Sahara actually means desert. So when people say, yeah, the Sahara Desert, you're actually saying the desert. So, but we'll come back to some Sahara stuff here in a little while. So, all right. So who were these older people according to the ancients? We talk about, or to the ancient Egyptians, we talk about the story of Atlantis. You have to remember, this story is originally coming from Egypt. But a lot of the names have been changed over the course of time because it's told by Greeks. So the word Atlantis is a Greek word, just like the word Egypt is a Greek word. It's Egyptus, which the Egyptians never called themselves that. They were the land of Kemet, which is the black land, which is actually named for the black soil that would wash down the Nile during the inundation season during the middle of summer, June, July, and so forth. And they would use that rich black soil to plant their crops. So it was actually Kemet, KMT. We, in English, added a couple of E's, KEMET. So Atlantis is actually a Greek word. The Egyptians called it, well, They called it something else. And we're going to get into that. But this time that these peoples lived in is called Zeptepi, the first time, the time in which the gods ruled. So I have a clip here from this last Egypt tour back in April, in which we're at Edfu Temple, and this is really our last copy of the original text of the Atlantis story, and it's incomplete. We only have pieces of it because there's only so much that they could actually write on the walls out there. So, but let me go ahead and play the clip, and then we'll go ahead and talk about it.
Interpretation of the text is the island of the primeval ones. And it's very, very similar to the details that we have in the Atlantis story. Like we were talking about yesterday, the Atlantis story as is written that we have is from Plato. Well, Plato got it from Solon, which was his great uncle a couple hundred years down the road. And Solon had come down here to Egypt, the Temple of Sais. We saw that photo of that ruined temple. So we no longer have the original text from there. Solon had gone there, talked to a priest named Sanchi, studied under him for a long period of time, and brought the story back to Greece with him. So, of course, the Egyptians, they like to tell their stories and spread their word. So this was a place when they built Edfu where they could record their history. And I believe they knew that there was something that was going to happen to their culture, that it was going to get lost. So they covered this temple with so much of their information, but they couldn't record every single detail, which is why we don't have the full story, but we have it in part up here of those, what they call the primeval ones. Like Ahmed was saying that, yeah, they've kind of deified them as gods. They could have been people that came, and their island was destroyed like Atlantis with water and fire and was completely lost. And then they had to survive and find a new land to rebuild their civilization. So when we see some of these, the pyramids and repurposing of these really old buildings, that was a part of that lost culture that they were rediscovering again and repurposing. Because Atlantis, the story that we see here as well, it wasn't just one island, it wasn't just one place, it was a worldwide culture. That was like the capital that we were seeing here getting destroyed, and it's really just a glimpse of that Atlantis story in part. Wish we could find, the bigger story, if we could find something under Sais, but like you said, they've kind of, it sounds like they stopped excavating there if it's become covered over again. Maybe find some lost scrolls or something. But this is it in part up here. The Zeptepi, the first time, is what they call it.
Yeah, so it was that wall that was directly behind me in that video clip that has that. Basically, it's a creation story. It's a creation story of the original lands that the primeval ones came from. We're not even talking about like the traditional netters, the traditional gods. Okay, we're talking about the original peoples that all of this came out from. So while that video clip was playing, I went and grabbed it. So there it is, Plato, Timaeus, and Critias. It's just a small thing. It's really small. And I have some markings in there for different significant parts. So yeah, it's just a couple pages in the Timaeus, and the Critias is maybe like a dozen pages or something. It's not big at all. So we have very little information when we talk about, we get this story from Plato, and there are so many stories and tales that I'm hearing these days coming from out of, I don't know where. It's like, I think people have gotten really fanciful with adding to the myth and the legend and all of that. Coming up with some different ideas. Maybe they're, and some people, I'm not going to totally discredit it. We have a lot of people that will say, well, I'm channeling information. I'm tapping into whether it's the collective unconscious or the Akashic records, or they're talking to, I don't know, their spirit guides or what have you. And they're or they're just free floating consciousness going back to that point in time. And I talk about that in Travels Through Time. And they will say, well, I saw this played out, or I went back to that point in time, or I inhabited my body from a past life, and I saw all this stuff from Atlantis. And they bring that information back with them. They bring that story back with them. And it seems like it gets added to this legend and lore of Atlantis. And I'm not discrediting that, because I've written about that myself. I've done that myself. But it becomes very challenging when we start talking about the story of Atlantis to know, okay, what actually came down through history that we still have, that we still physically have, that I can put in my hand and say, this is what Plato said. This is what Solon said. This is what Sanchi said. This is what's written on the walls. And what might come from somebody else. And then what that boils down to is, do I trust the person that is saying it? And that's always the big challenge here within our industry. When we talk about people channeling information or downloading information, these sorts of things. Do I trust that person that's telling me? Because it becomes very, very difficult to prove whatever they might be seeing or whatever information might come into their head. Again, I've done the same thing. So do you trust me? Like Aladdin, do you trust me? But seriously, it's so we have to be careful of that. So when we talk about Atlantis being a civilization that's spread out, that is actually in the written works. They do talk about how that civilization was widespread, basically across Europe into Asia a little bit, the northern part of Africa there, and then of course the actual Atlantic portion of it. So we at least know that. We know it was a civilization that did spread wide. It was not just, when we talk about the concentric rings, we're talking about the capital city of Atlantis. We'll talk a little bit more about that here soon. So, okay. So we're at Edfu here. Edfu is a very important temple because it contains a lot of records that from other temples have been lost to time. Not just the creation story, but other things as well. So this is what Edfu actually looks like. If the slide will pop up there. There we go. Now, this was taken the first time that I went there just after COVID. So it's like there's nobody there but the guard. Going there this time around, we didn't even use that main entrance. We went around the side because it was like wall-to-wall people. And they're at least right down the middle, because people go through that main entrance and they go to the Holy of Holies, which, yeah, is cool. But the good juicy stuff is on the outside, which you saw part of that there. So I have a very, very cool book, and I got to thank Jen for getting this for me for Christmas. This really blew my mind. And you can't even see the cover. Because this actually didn't come with the dust jacket, but this is the book here, The Mythical Origin of the Egyptian Temple, and this is by Eve Raymond back in the 1960s, and she had spent years there studying the text at Edfu. Now, this is not just a straight translation, word from word, of the Edfu text. I would love that. I would absolutely love that. This isn't that, although there are a lot of quotes in here. So basically, this is like her interpretation or her translation of the texts that are there. And so we focus in on a couple of areas of this when it comes to the Atlantis story. The whole, so much of it is the Atlantis story. But it gets into a lot of ideas of not just one island, but a number of different islands, and then what these different beings were and what their functionality was, and this sort of stuff. When we're looking at, I guess I should say, when we're looking for that key that tells us, oh, this is the Atlantis story, other than the fact that, you have the creation part of it, it's the destruction. It's that destruction that we key in on, because it's a story that we hear throughout civilization. Yes, it adheres to Atlantis. Atlantis was destroyed. There were some survivors. We hear that cataclysm story. There was a flood. There was whatever happened. Most people died. There were some survivors. And we do find that here in the Edfu texts. So I'm just going to read this off the slide. And this is within her work, where it describes, quote unquote, excuse me, an ancient world having been constituted was destroyed, and as a dead world, it came to be the basis of a new period of creation, which at first was the recreation and resurrection of what once had existed in the past. And that's just a snippet of a greater whole, but basically this is the thing that's, kind of the indicator. Oh, here it is. Here is the story. This is where we're talking about what they called it was the homeland of the primeval ones, not Atlantis. And that's a little wordy, right? So, I can imagine Plato, he's writing this out, or it's passed down from Solon. We don't know which one would have actually named this Atlantis, but we're talking about this idea of a capital city being out there beyond the Pillars of Hercules. What do we call that? Well, we're calling it the Atlantic Ocean. So we're going to call that country, that continent, that capital city, we're going to call that Atlantis. That's the Greeks. Again, the Greeks came along and renamed everything. Like when we talk about, just for example, the city of Luxor. Okay, so all kinds of temples that are there. Well, it's called Luxor now because when the Islamic nations came in, the Arabs came in, they saw all of these temples, didn't realize that they were temples, thought they were all palaces. And so this basically means, the place of the palaces. Well, when the Greeks ruled the area before that, when they came in and they conquered the Egyptians, basically Alexander the Great came in, conquered the Egyptians, they renamed everything. So they came down to that part and saw this magnificent city that they believed looked like their city of Thebes. So they named the city Thebes. Well, the ancient Egyptians named that city Waset. Why did they name it Waset? It means place of power, city of power. So to them, that was power. But Waset, Thebes, Luxor, very, very different names. So again, when we hear Atlantis, it's not what the ancient Egyptians called it. The ancient Egyptians called it homeland of the primeval ones. In that era, they called Zep Tepi. We're calling it, we call it, depending on the era, right? Younger Dryas. We've got, I won't go down that road, but we could get into all kinds of stuff. But let me give you another quote out of this. And this is kind of interesting. So again, this is from Eve Raymond. So this particular, the time span of this home of the primeval ones, we may anticipate, appears to be limited and ended in darkness. The first event that was believed to have occurred in this home seems to have been the bringing into existence of the form. We suspect that this statement alludes to the origin of the subsequent generation of gods who are in our sources described as the cause of the primeval ones, of the generation of the great shining one. Oh, wait a minute. Great shining one. This should really set off some bells for people who have been studying things like the Watchers, the Anunnaki, any of those type of beings, because in many cases they are called the shining ones. And you actually see reference to the shining ones in a lot of different cultures around the world as well. So here we see this again with the ancient Egyptians. When we're talking about Zep Tepi, we're talking about the first time, we're talking about the homeland, the primeval ones. We also have these shining ones that are there. So that becomes another really fascinating aspect of the whole story. And again, when we're talking about those the stories of the cataclysms, the Shining Ones are involved in this as well. So here we have another reference back to something that we are familiar with in many of these other stories across the world. It's all the same story that we see again and again and again throughout these different cultures. So different comments and questions down in here. Let's see. So Rodrigo's in the house from Portugal. Great to see you, Rodrigo. Appreciate it. Adam's here with us tonight. Wonderful. And yeah, Rodrigo, the seven sages. Yeah, and you find the seven sages throughout all these different cultures as well. Absolutely. And Tom asks, was Atlantis destroyed by an earthquake or a volcano? So what we know is water and fire. So that leaves a lot to be interpreted there. So volcano is, sure, that's a possibility that's on the table. There's some different islands throughout the Mediterranean that we know for a fact were volcanic. Like Santorini is one of those places that people point to that because you kind of see that ring shape around it, and there was the volcano in the middle. So you're like, oh, this could have been Atlantis, and the volcano blew and destroyed, all the people. Yeah, except there's a lot of things about Santorini that just don't line up with it being Atlantis. So yeah, water and fire. So like the idea of the comet impact theory, that works. Comet hits, or some people believe that it wasn't just one impact, but as the comet came through the atmosphere, it was dropping bits of itself into different areas. So you had a lot of impacts of the comet. And so, but where it impacted into the ice sheet, very, very quick melt, the seas rise, and then you have the fire from off of the comet from those impacts. Could that have also, rocks the earth, right? So does that have a cascading effect? So if it's large comet smacks into the earth, does it trigger earthquakes and volcanoes on top of that? And then, okay, so you've got earthquakes going on under the ocean, perhaps. Does that kick off a tsunami, then blankets the island after you have all this fire preceding that? We don't know. We just don't know. So a lot of speculation as to what exactly happened there. Rodrigo, this is interesting. We have stories of Atlanteans landing here in Portugal. The idea is that the survivor might have been scattered from Iberia to Egypt, all across the Mediterranean. Yeah, it's interesting there, because one of the theories is that the capital of Atlantis was there on the Iberian Peninsula in Spain. I forget the exact area that is called, but that's one of the ideas. Or if it was even like out there in the Azores, because that's another idea, that survivors from there would have made it Portugal, Spain, into the Mediterranean. Of course, Egypt is one of those places. That's what we're kind of talking about. Was Egypt Atlantis? When we look at Heliopolis, there are many people that believe that Heliopolis, which was the capital of Egypt for many, many years. Again, it was not originally called Heliopolis. That's what the Greeks called it. But there are many people who believe that that was the capital of Atlantis. Again, it's another theory that's thrown out there. And honestly, looking at Heliopolis and its setup, I can't really see that being the capital of Atlantis. When we're looking at like the concentric rings and all that sort of thing, it doesn't really work out. But it being perhaps a very important city of Atlantis, because Atlantis, again, did spread out. We know that. So could it have been a very important part of Atlantis? That is very possible. And when we look at the structures around Egypt, like when we look at the pyramids, when we look at like the Osirion, back behind the Temple of Abydos, those structures that don't have the hieroglyphs. They appear to predate the rest of Egypt. The dynastic Egyptians, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, all the kingdoms, wrote hieroglyphs everywhere, all over the place. Just all over the place, they wrote hieroglyphs. But yet you have these other structures in which there's nothing. And some of the ones that are the biggest and most magnificent, like the pyramids, there's nothing written there. In the Great Pyramid, there's the forgery that's up there in the one chamber above the king's chamber. But and that's it. And that's just painted on. But we don't find hieroglyphs in any of those. So even a lot of the local Egyptians say, no. Those predated us. We came from where we came from. They were there. We repurposed them. So so we get into that when we go down our into our Egypt discussions. And Rodrigo, I have not yet been to Portugal, but that is definitely on my bucket list. There's a lot that I want to explore there. So he also tells us, decades ago, an unknown writing was discovered here too. Many people say there may be a connection. Writing meaning language. That's fascinating. Yeah, there are some. I have to look that one up. There are some languages, ancient languages, that we have not been able to decipher yet. So it'd be interesting to take a look at. Would that be in Atlantean script? So all right. Another thing at Edfu that we see. Again, I mentioned Edfu being an important temple. It's kind of like a survivor of sorts of these really important other temples. So you saw Plutarch mention Sais, gone. Plutarch mentioned Heliopolis, gone. These are places that Solon visited. There's a couple scant remnants of Heliopolis. We'll look at that here in a moment. But yeah, these important places, gone. But Edfu's still there, which is great. Edfu also has, you can see it right dead center there, stargates. That one actually means great stargate. So I have a little clip here that I'm going to play about some of the stargates that we have found there. They're different than other stargate locations.
Because it's plural.
It's plural, yes. Because you have the three strikes here, so that makes it plural. So this would be stargates inside here. So we'll see that on one of the walls inside too, the representation of stargates. I think the one inside is Great Stargate is what we'll see, if I recall correctly. Yeah. But this is stargates here as we go in. Yep. Okay, just to note, because we're coming in from outside, walking in here, headed toward the significant part of the text. And we see another stargate right here. This is just a singular one, though. So I wasn't even looking for this one. I was looking for a Great Stargate somewhere in here. I think it's further down there. But we have one Stargate here. We have multiple Stargates here. And Ahmed is saying that very well could mean 100. So 100 Stargates in the story here. So rather than being on the gates, it's part of the story here in the Edfu texts.
Yeah. So Jennifer, who's been to Egypt with me, she was the one finding all the stargates all over the place. So usually the way that something is labeled a stargate is it's right next to the doorway that you're about to walk through, and you have the stargate symbol that's right there, and then usually the king that is associated with the king that has the authority to activate the stargate. In Edfu, it's different. You don't find those next to the doorways like that. It's a part of the story text, where within the story, there are records. They are actually talking about the stargates. And this is actually very, very important for the book that I'm in the middle of writing. So, again, Edfu telling us some more detail about the way the world used to operate. Another thing that we also find there at Edfu is the levitation of the temple. So this is kind of cryptic, and we don't quite understand what they mean by levitation of the temple. I mean, were they physically levitating the temple up off the ground? That seems maybe not. Was that talking about elevating the consciousness of the temple, or elevating the consciousness of the people within the temple? Or was the elevation to take us to a higher realm, maybe to take us to the cosmos, maybe even being like a stargate sort of a thing? We don't really know. But we do see a connection there to other temples. So Temple of Esna, and I have not been to Esna. Doesn't want to pop up. There it is, Temple of Esna. It's just a small temple, but it is quite important, and just going through some restoration work. Very, very beautiful artwork on the ceilings. Kind of, in my opinion, almost rivals Dendara. Dendara has that magnificent blue. With Esna, it's like these beautiful oranges and yellows and reds. I'm not going to show a photo of the ceiling here, but the wall here, you see again that levitation of the temple right there. And why is that important? Okay, they showed this at Edfu, they showed this at Esna. Well, the temples had things that were called tutelary gods and goddesses. So basically what that is, it's a guardian or protector of that temple. Well, the tutelary goddess of, we talk about the Temple of Sais, was Neith. At Esna, it's Neith. Come on. There we go. So there's Neith. So Neith, very important goddess there at Esna. Tutelary goddess at Sais. Neith was creation goddess. In the Esna temple records, does have an account of creation in which Neith brings forth the Nun, the first land from the primeval waters. So there is, once again, our connection back to the homeland of the primeval ones. So was the levitation of the temple a part of that? And what's interesting is, you notice when they're levitating the temple, and you see this actually throughout a lot of the artwork around Egypt, that whether it's one of the gods or whether it's one of the kings, that notice I don't ever say Pharaoh. Again, Pharaoh was in Egypt, or Pharaoh was a Greek word that they came and started using. It's not an Egyptian word. The Egyptians called their kings kings. They even call, like, Hatshepsut, even though she was a woman, she was king. So in any case, you see them using these scepters to do different things, like, levitate the temple, or other different actions. We don't have any of those scepters. They're called Waz scepters. Remember, we talked about Luxor, previously Thebes, previously Wasat, place of power, city of power. Waz scepter, basically a power scepter. And we can't find any of them everywhere in Egyptian artwork. We've got so many artifacts from ancient Egypt, and yet we've never found one of these things. Well, I could go down a conspiracy theory route with that, but I'm not going to. All right. So, talked a little bit about, where might we have also had these records that we're finding at Edfu. Where might we be able to find some additional information about Atlantis? Somewhere in Egypt, since this is where the story came from, right? Well, What about the Library of Alexandria? The photo will come up here. I don't know why it's working so slow. So Library of Alexandria, this is a artist's interpretation. We have no idea what it looked like. It was destroyed in a fire 48 BC, basically during the war with Caesar. And so Caesar was besieged at Alexandria. Remember, he had become very friendly with Cleopatra there. And he was basically defending himself at Alexandria. His soldiers set fire to some of the Egyptian ships docked at the Alexandrian port while he was trying to clear the wharves to block the fleet belonging to Cleopatra's brother, Ptolemy. This fire purportedly spread to other parts of the city, geez, if I could talk, and spread. And unfortunately took the library with it. So they say there are like some 40,000 records that were lost in the fire. Now, we didn't lose all the records from the Library of Alexandria because they did have there was a daughter library at the Serapeum, which is a temple of Serapis in town. It was part of the Museum, which basically, I think museum, but basically it was a big learning center. And this later got used by a lot of the Neoplatonists, and it still became a learning center until it was almost 400 AD, where Christianity was becoming a big thing, and it was considered heathen, and then they destroyed it. But we did have records from the Library of Alexandria that did exist and survive for a while. We've kind of talked about that when we've talked about like the Ouroboros and some of that ancient symbolism. But the Library of Alexandria probably very likely would have been a place that would have housed this story with all of those scrolls that were there. I'd probably bet everything that I have on the idea that probably even a fuller story of Atlantis was there at the Library of Alexandria, more than we see on the walls at Edfu, because the scrolls a lot easier to write a bigger story in the scrolls than to carve it in on the wall. So we would have had more detail there. There's also Heliopolis. Of Egypt for a very, very long time. And some do believe that this may have been the site of the capital. I don't believe that. But here at Heliopolis, and so many obelisks from Heliopolis have been taken from here and delivered to other parts of the world, like London, Paris, New York. Yes, pretty sad. But here, English Egyptologist I.E.S. Edwards pointed out that Heliopolis was the site of the quote-unquote inventory building. It had been the center of astronomical science closely connected to Giza. Sir Alan H. Gardner believed that the inventory building was some sort of archive in which the pharaoh or king, Khufu, sorry, I'm just reading that little bit, Khufu was searching for information about the secret chambers, the primeval sanctuary of Thoth. Yeah, you just heard that. Secret quote, chest of flint hidden in Heliopolis, which contained a document which described the secret chamber of the sanctuary of Thoth, which Khufu wanted a copy for his temple. So you see here, Heliopolis would have been a place that would have stored a lot of very important records, things that were hidden in secret. Things from Thoth was the god of knowledge. So he would have been the keeper of like all the records, all the secret knowledge, all of that. And so you have many of these archaeologists over the years that believed that these secret chambers were there in Heliopolis, at least important records. Again, lost to time. We don't have that anymore. It's been gone. Let's see. Rodrigo, I speculate the trauma of the sunken Atlantis may make them fantasize about a sentient from the waters. The mix of Egyptian style with the Greek style looks very harmonious. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. The way that the Ptolemaic dynasty worked, you do have that mix of Greek and Egyptian, just like when the Romans came in, then you had a bit of the Roman style and so forth. So each culture that has come in kind of tweaked it and put their stamp on it. Unfortunately, I hate to say it, but the Islamic culture, when it came in, didn't care so much about it until a couple hundred years ago, basically after Napoleon came and took an interest in the ancient sites and started sending that information back. Napoleon was actually really good about it. He brought in artists and scientists and all this to actually study the ancient buildings and sent all that back to Europe, which people suddenly took a massive interest in and came flocking to Egypt. And so then it was after that, like, oh, people around the world are actually interested in this old stuff that we've been squatting in and camping out in. That's why there's so much soot on a lot of the temple ceilings, is that people needed shelter, and you got this big building over here to provide some shelter, and so they would go do that. But yeah, the Greeks and Romans had their own stamps on it. Cleopatra, we talked about her a moment ago. She was actually Greek. She was of the Ptolemaic dynasty. So basically, Alexander the Great came in, took over Egypt, placed Ptolemy in charge, and basically all of his descendants ran Egypt. And so Cleopatra, the one that is famous, was actually the 7th Cleopatra. So she was actually Greek. So yeah, in Victoria, that's the thing. Maybe they're in private collection. You're talking about the law scepters. That's, like I said, I'm not going to go all conspiracy theory this evening, but that's what I believe, that they are in private collections. In Pandora Farms, is there any traceable lineage of those survivors to any living today? That becomes very challenging, because you think about people from back then that lived, if they had descendants, you're talking, there's going to be thousands of people. You can do DNA tests. I know they've done this with like Genghis Khan, because they have some DNA from Genghis Khan, and they were able to like like more than half of the people around the area that was considered Mongolia back in the day. Over half of them have like some part of his DNA. It's like crazy. All right. So yeah, and France still has a large amount of resources. Yeah, so you go to the Louvre, they have a massive Egypt section. They basically looted Egypt. We've covered that before in some other classes. So, all right. So one other thing that I want to talk about, we got like 2 minutes left here, but I wanted to talk about that in this, and that is this, the Eye of the Sahara. And I want to talk about this because of the fact I keep getting asked about it, and no, I just straight up, no, I do not believe it is Atlantis. So, okay. This is, according to geologists, the formation's concentric rings are primarily composed of sedimentary rocks, including sandstone and limestone. Features an underlying alkaline igneous complex, including igneous rocks called gabbaric rocks, which form as a result of magmatic activity and hydrothermal alteration. That's a mouthful, okay? But basically, this is a naturally occurring structure. So basically, it's a fancy way to say that the Earth's material became so hot it turned into magma or liquid rock and then forced itself into the surrounding rocks, slowly cooling into a crystalline structure. Erosion, both by wind and water, has also helped to sculpt. They call this a Richat structure. Everybody calls it the Eye of Sahara. Into its present form, exposing different rock types and creating its concentric layers in circular shape. Differential erosion rates between the softer and more resistant layers have further contributed to the striking appearance of the formation today. Okay, so let me kind of rattling all that off real quick, but yeah, so let's kind of talk about just real quick again, some of the reasons why I do not believe it's Atlantis. One, there's no structures. There's like no human structures. Okay. So when you look at the story of Atlantis, they had, oh my gosh, they had all kinds of structures. They had wharfs, they had temples, they had gymnasiums, they had stadiums, they had all of this stuff. According to Mr. Plato, who got it from Mr. Solon, who got it from Sanchis. There's nothing there. There's no ruins at all. Also, if you look at this, there's no connections between the rings. Okay, the way that the rings in Atlantis were constructed, they connected to each other, and then they went out to the sea. You don't have that here. And then also over the top of the rings, you had bridges in some places, and well, there's no ruins of bridges. And there's also supposed to be mountains around this. So, to quote Plato, the region as a whole was said to be high above the level of the sea, which from it rose precipitously. The city was surrounded by a uniformly flat plain, which in turn enclosed by mountains that came right down to the sea. The mountains which surrounded it were celebrated as being more numerous, higher, and more beautiful than any which exists today. Well, there's no high mountains around there. Like none. Yes, there's supposed to be a flat plain, but then the mountains rose up and then cascaded down to the sea, and they were supposed to be really tall. And you just don't have that. Also, if these were the rings, so they cut those channels into the rings, right? Well, those weren't the only channels that they cut. Those were not the only canals. There's supposed to be other ones. So channels about 100 feet broad were cut from the ditch's landward limb straight across the plain at a distance of 100 stades from each other till they ran into it on its seaward side. They cut cross channels between them and also to the city, and used the whole complex to float timber down from the mountains and transport seasonal produce by boat. So a stade is about 625 feet or an eighth of a mile. So yeah, you're talking about these other long canals and channels that you got your big mountains that you're cutting timber, bringing that down, produce from the plains, they're bringing down these. So this book here has a rudimentary little map of the Atlantis area. It's kind of crude, but basically they have the ringed capital city there next to the ocean, and then you got your plains with the canals, and then you've got your mountains surrounding it. And you don't have that here. It's not there. So it's not it. It's cool. It is really, really cool looking. And I think it's one of those, whenever we see the circles, that we automatically think Atlantis. And that is an important note, because I believe that there's something encoded in our DNA that when we look at, whether it's the concentric circles like that, or whether it's the spiral pattern, that we do think back to that older time, that we do think back to Atlantis. In the upcoming book that I'm writing, I do talk about how, I believe that not only is that pattern, designated as a portal, which many cultures talk about that symbol being the symbol for a portal, but I also believe it is a memory of that time of Atlantis. People remember that city. So, all right, I'm going to, and Karen, that might be a thing. The Vatican could have information about Atlantis in their archives. Yeah, absolutely. So, they have so much that's hidden down there. Things that they do not want the world to know about. They might have those Waz scepters. They might have them. And they might actually have some additional information there about Atlantis that they don't want people to get a hold of. And it's going to stay down there until much of this world changes. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Those that are members of the Connected Universe portal, stay there. We're going to chat a little bit longer here during our after show, of course. For everybody else, I do encourage you, hey, become a traveler with us in the Connected Universe portal. Hang out with us for the after shows. You get everything else that's within the portal as well. So much stuff. You do have the monthly Q&A video that is coming out here. That'll be out before the end of the week. And so much more. And Rodrigo, I really appreciate that. Yeah, and no, I'm not afraid to say that we don't know. There are many things that we just don't know, and that's actually part of the excitement of all of this. Trying to solve that mystery. It could be this, it could be that. Which one is it? And yeah, some of those things we don't know. And of course, people argue and debate and all that, but I have fun with it. I have a lot of fun with it. So, all right. That'll do it for the public broadcast for this evening. Till next time, time really exists.